So in determining the age group, we would look at the complexity of the material and often at what age it's studied in schools, because with nonfiction you can look across the curriculum and see, when it's being studied in schools. And then, of course, the level of the writing. So, for example, if we're doing a book about war and it gets very graphic, that's going to certainly catapult you into the 10 up age range. We just did a book on a war dog, Stubby the war dog, who was a hero of World War I, and the 100th anniversary of that is coming up. And we worked with Ann Bowsam on that book. And with the dog perspective, it kind of aged it down a little. So then that was a little bit more comfortable in 8 to 12. So it just depends. But level is very important in children's books. We have a series of books that we do on leveled readers. And of course, reading's developmental. So it's, not always a strict age range, but it's more of a reading comfort level. And you have to pay attention to, of course, vocabulary and sentence structure and all of that. So it can be complicated, but those are all the factors that go into it.
Storytelling, in general, you do have to have a wonderful idea for a story, no matter what you're writing. But when you're writing, and I would actually make a bigger distinction, there's writing adult, there's writing a book, and then there's writing a picture book. And a picture book, if you're focusing on a picture book, you're actually the more comparable analogy would be a poem. It doesn't have to rhyme, and actually many times it really shouldn't. But you're trying to pack a lot of information that flows, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end in very, very few words. It's actually one of the most difficult forms to write in for that reason. To be able to capture the imagination, to be visual in your story so that the pictures, the illustrations make sense. If you're just writing the text, that the illustrator would be able to read it and already have images in their minds of what the illustration should be. So you're doing more than developing your story when you're writing a picture book. You have to have a fantastic character voice. It is what drives a child to continue reading, is that they connect to that voice, and that's extremely important. Especially these days, this is what publishers are looking for. There are many picture books from yesteryear that are very popular still, but you wouldn't be able to sell to a publisher now. They're too long, and many publishers don't want to take on a very long picture book. What they're looking for right now are very character-driven books. And I have an example for you of one author that I recently sold, Emily Kate Moon, and this is her character, June. You just see this character and you fall in love with her. You want to know why she has a turtle on top of her hat, why she's wearing a purple hat and an orange dress, and she seems pretty happy out there, and you want to know why. And so this character, just in and of itself, when there was an image of June waving that I received in the query, I had to know more about her. And then when I did get to know her, then you have the story. And the story has to be captive.
I think one of the big things that children's picture book authors make a mistake on is they forget that these are books that are meant to be read aloud. So I think that every word counts in a children's picture book. It's kind of like poetry in that way. And I think sometimes they'll write a manuscript that's a little too long or that doesn't focus as much on the language as it needs to be. The other thing is sometimes they don't leave enough room for the illustrators to do the showing. That if you are telling too much in a manuscript, it doesn't leave enough room for the illustrators to do their job. So I think those are two big mistakes.
I thought that this would be an early reader book, but I wasn't I didn't feel confident enough in my writing to send it off to HarperCollins I Could Read, because I knew that they were the best of the best. And I thought, okay, you know, my writing's just not there yet. I didn't feel like it. And so I sent it off to, I believe it was Random House, and they rejected it, and she said she felt like it was more of a picture book. And I thought, no, it's not. I think it's an I Can Read. I mean, it's a beginning reader. And so what I did was one afternoon, I just went over to Borders Books when they were in business, and I just got every I Can Read I could find. I read them, and I counted the words. And then I realized that they did have guidelines, and I didn't know that. But I did. I counted the words, and I thought, okay, they might get me on just not liking the book, but they're not going to get me on format. And so I just, whenever I wrote this, I wrote it within the parameters of what I found. Like most the level 2 ones were about 800 words, level 2s were about 1,200. So I did mine about 900 right in the middle. I thought, okay, you know, level 2s were between 8 and 12, and so I tried to keep mine right in the middle. And so I sent it off, and I got it back saying that we really like this, the theme of your story, but it doesn't fit in one of our formats. And I was like, what? I mean, I spent, you know, a lot of time, you know, making like a graph. And so she said, can you add another chapter? And I was like, sure. And so then she bought it. So, but they do have parameters. I do even think that they count the number of spaces they have. I mean, because once I went back to look at the guidelines, they're pretty strict guidelines as far as what the content they have. I know they have some type of an educational board that determines if the words are too big or what words they can use for the different levels. So I think it's pretty strict.
I love middle grade, and it's funny because when I first started writing, I thought I wanted to write young adult, even though I was teaching 7th grade at the time, because 7th grade I always said is a weird kind of wiggle year where they could read middle grade or they could read young adult because they're 12, and middle grade is 8 to 12 and young adult is 12 to 18. And it's funny because I ended up landing in middle grade, and I love it because I love middle school age kids. They still get so excited about things, whereas when I do events for high schoolers, it's so hard because you don't get any reaction from them. They're very flat-faced. You can't tell if you're getting them excited. Whereas when I go into elementary schools and middle schools, you can tell when you're making connections with those kids. They're excited, their hands are in the air, they're wiggling, they can't wait to ask you their questions. So middle school age kids are just my favorite in general to talk to and work with, so it kind of makes sense that I ended up here. They're my people. As far as what a secret formula is for a middle grade book, I think you just have to have a lot of action, especially if you're writing a book for boys. They can tell if you're writing authentically or if you're trying to like preach a moral to them. They can sniff that out immediately. And they just want to have fun with the book. They want a book that they can relate to that has elements of their own life. About friendship and discovering new things and kind of learning how to be an adult, but you're not quite there yet. And so I don't know if there's a secret formula as much as just writing a story that you feel passionate about and making sure that it has got some action in there.
I think because both of us are still very kid-like, like we play with a lot of Legos, video games, we like reading comics and cartoons. So I think like when we talk to kids especially, we get along quite well with them, so I think that's reflected in the books. Yeah, I guess for like whether it's age appropriate, when we write, we try very hard to make sure that we don't sound condescending to kids, because a lot of times when you're writing to kids that young, you maybe try and over-explain or use words that are maybe too simple. We try very hard not to do that, and I think we've gotten better because we've written 12 books already.
13.
Right? 13?
Yeah.
13 books already.
When we write for young adults, there's a tendency to talk down to them and not to speak to them as equals. I think that's a terrible mistake. Often young adults are as smarter than the adults that we're writing for. So it's not a question of that. Sometimes a question of knowledge, and it's a question of orientation. In young adult writing, I think it's really important to keep the emotional life of the character in the forefront, the stakes, the problems, the difficulties this character is having emotionally. That is always going to read so that you know that there's something difficult in the person's life, in drama and YA. In adult fiction, that may not necessarily be the way that every chapter reads. And you can take time with description, you can take a little more leisurely time, maybe evolving a slow relationship in an adult novel that in a YA might happen a little faster. Of course, there's language, and sometimes in a young adult novel, you'll use simpler words and not as complicated. You'll use simpler words and not as complicated diction as you would in an adult novel. But I think actually that they're very similar, and I think there's just a question of tone and language, really.
To write a children's book, I think the most important thing is to not try to talk to children or to try to talk down to children, but to share an idea that you have, something that lives within your life, your experience, that you would like to share. And so I didn't really ever intend to write Cassandra's Angel. I was thinking about the stories that we are given from the people in our lives, whether that's from our parents, our teachers, our friends, the government, the media. And what I realized is that there is not one of us walking around in the world that isn't carrying some kind of story, a story of lack, limitation, not being good enough. And so that became the idea of how do we let go of those stories and find a new story. And as I was thinking about that idea, one day I sat down to journal, and Cassandra's Angel just came out in one long sentence.